Welcome back to this edition of the Fourth Estate. Charles Mwangu Shampagi, and with me in studio tonight I have Ivan Okuda. He's a lawyer and a journalist at the Daily Monitor. Ivan, very nice to have you.
Thank you, Charles. Profoundly humbled to be on this platform, and a very good evening to our beloved viewers.
Sulaiman Kakaire is also a lawyer and a journalist. Very nice to have you.
At the Observer.
At the Observer, yes. Thank you for the qualification.
Good evening, viewers.
And, of course, Obed Katurebe. Obed works with the Uganda Government Media Center. Very nice to have you, Obed.
Thank you, Charles, and good evening, viewers.
Let me start with you, Obed. You just watched the long-awaited address to the nation of President Robert Gabriel Mugabe, as they call him, Comrade Bob Mugabe, of ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. It doesn't appear to me that in that speech he indicated that he's either resigning or handing over power to anybody or taking a backstage. He's just given a speech of what his party and his government intends to do for Zimbabwe in the next few days. Talked about dealing with issues of conflict within the party and how it must be resolved harmoniously. He talks about the failings of the past, and he says those failings of the past must be dealt with, not with anger, not with bitterness. What do you make of that speech? And what is the status of President Mugabe now?
Well, President Mugabe remains president. At least going by his speech, I know most of the world wanted to hear him resigning, and probably those who are not with him would celebrate. But he is still the enigma he has always been. So he's just given what he thinks should be done. But the message underlying is that he is stepping down. Of course, he was assuring the nation. So those who think probably he intends to cling on and probably cause chaos as he tries to cling on, the message was, I'm not in for that. I'm stepping down shortly. But it's all about the procedures of ZANU-PF, going through the normal procedures of the party, and then the man steps down. But over and above, the message is clear, he's going.
Kakaire, is that your reading of the speech by President Mugabe?
Yeah, but I don't intend to differ substantially from what Obed has said. The reading of the situation is that ZANU-PF is still in charge. It's not that there is a movement from one person to another. And what this speech is speaking to, because Charles, if you follow the language of that speech, you realize that it's a negotiated document out of a process. The Mugabe, you know, will not be addressing the people and telling them we have to correct the mistakes. We have to correct particular things. We have to refocus as a country. The Mugabe, you know, naturally knows that whatever has been happening in Zimbabwe was what he thought was the right thing. But you see that this is not his language. Now, what happens is that we have to understand why are they doing this. The people who are coming after him are trying to do public relations, basically. They are trying to tell the international community, well, it's not about Mugabe, that he has maybe the reading of the situation should be quite different from what you are saying, that it's not a coup. But technically, and I think they make a scope from a communications perspective, they have managed the public relations rightly, and they are, well, another one can construct a narrative that perhaps the party is going through a transition, although the transition has been triggered by particular by the fact that there was a power configuration that had shifted. Because if Mugabe was the very person in the process of this transition, whatever he wanted would have come to pass. The person he sacked a few weeks back is the one now steering the process of this transition. But that person wants to come with the full support of both the people in his power structure and those who were allies of the Mugabe group, the Grace Mugabe group, and is trying to cause some level of cohesion within the party. And to let these people that perhaps you can come and negotiate your position in the power structure. And that's what we are seeing. Now, what does it mean for the ordinary Zimbabweans? It does not address their problems.
Which are?
The problem is that Zimbabwe is going through economic turmoil. It's a fact. The welfare of the people is one of the poorest country in the world, and in Africa, its economic performance hasn't been any better. By any standard, the situation is very bad. Now, that is when we speak to issues of governance. Here we are not seeing the trade unions. The gentleman who is going to take over from Mugabe, Mnangagwa himself, who is the likely successor, was at the front of trying to make sure that all these ones are destroyed. The institutions, the platforms where the ordinary people perhaps would be seen and their voices are being could be heard.
Okay. Ivan, let me come to you quickly there.
Yes.
You watched the speech. We've been waiting for it the whole day. I think every network you saw that Sheila couldn't sign out the news because we had to switch to that very important speech that everybody was anticipating. Taken by surprise, caught off guard,
no,
what would you say?
Interesting set of events, because Charles, 2 weeks ago we had a show here where one of your questions was in respect to the internal contradictions in the NRM and this whole 20 quarter debate on the constitution and whether Article 1 or 2 Clause B should be amended. And I think my response was, the only predictable thing about politics is its unpredictability. So much that between now and 2021 is a very long time. Anything can happen. And I think precisely that's what we've seen. 2 weeks ago, it was possibly incomprehensible for anyone to imagine Zimbabwe would be in the kind of situation that Comrade Gabriel Mugabe finds himself in. And here we are. But I think, whereas he's not expressly announced his resignation, I think his fate is sealed, specifically because of a meeting that was held today in Harare, which meeting of the ZANU-PF top leadership agreed that he'd be kicked out of the chairmanship of the party.
Yes,
sacked, alongside his wife. So I checked the Zimbabwean constitution. Under Article 97 of the constitution of that country, you would require a resolution of Senate to have the president removed, and they put in place the benchmarks for removing a president: misconduct, failure to protect the constitution, if he's become mentally and physically incapable of leading the country. Compared to Uganda, their constitution makes it a little easier to remove a president. Here you have to go through Supreme Court and then medical board if it's medical reasons. It's a bit more complicated. Yeah, so it's easier to remove a president in Zimbabwe, and technically and legally remains president, because the expulsion from ZANU-PF in respect to his position as president has no legal consequence, but has very significant political consequences. And I think, of course, the politics is more important than the law here. What that essentially means is he's been given a timeline of up to tomorrow midday, according to what we've been reading in the national media.
The press statement that was issued after the after that meeting,
to resign.
The resolution of ZANU-PF.
And from the speech, he's seeming to play the belligerent card and possibly not willing to resign, at least between now and midday. If he doesn't resign, then the chief whip of ZANU-PF will be moving to Senate and the organs that are established under Article 97 of the Constitution to start the legal process of having him removed from president. I don't think they can be patient to allow him finish this term.
Obed, this speech, the speech is just read. He missed some page or pages, and we're wondering whether those pages contained the important announcement that everybody was waiting for. But if you listen to this speech and compare it with the press release that was issued earlier this afternoon about the meeting that Ivan is talking about, they seem to be speaking at variance. Here you are seeing a president who appears to be still in charge, articulating his party and his government's plans for the next few days. How do you reconcile? And earlier you had a press statement where the party top organs held a meeting, 210 I think out of about 300 of the party structures, making a unanimous decision. One, to sack the president, though that came as one of the last points, Comrade Mugabe, which means he will have to leave the presidency. Once that is done, they fired the members of the G40, reversed a lot of decisions that were made by the party earlier, and an extraordinary meeting that took place in 2014. They said the decisions taken by that meeting in 2014 that fired a number of people, all those have been reversed and they have been brought back into the party. And they list a whole long line.
Including those who have retired
yes.
and are no longer in public life.
Yes. The long list of people who have been fired is led by Comrade
Emerson.
No. Comrade Grace Mugabe. She's on top of it. You have Kasukuwera, you have the Moyos, you have
Jonathan
Moyo, and the whole group who belong to the G40, which is believed to have been the vehicle that Mugabe's wife, Grace, was using to take power from her husband, taking advantage of her husband. And now you have the husband coming, or the president of the country coming, and not mentioning anything about that meeting, not mentioning anything about...
No, I think, like you observed, he himself confessed to have probably, you could have forgotten a certain page. But, and I guess probably that page had the very paragraph that most people were waiting for. But there's something, I want to try and attempt to study the picture. President Mugabe was accompanied by a host of all military generals and some other probably party members, meaning whatever he was delivering is what they had agreed on, and probably they had read through his speech.
Can I ask, Studio, if you have that image to give it to us, the image of the president giving his speech and the people he was seated with.
Yes.
When you find it, if you can flash it.
But even the preamble of his speech, he says the army chose to take a decision by whatever merits and merits, he's bound to go by what they've chosen to do. And the tone of his speech and all that is a tone of resignation and probably looking forward to Zimbabwe under a different leadership altogether. The only paragraph or the only sentence of saying I step down and hand over to some other gentleman is what missed. But certainly that one is obvious and scamming. Looking at the trend of what has happened ever since...
But some people might think that this is being... you called him an enigma. This being classic Robert Gabriel Mugabe. He will not cede ground until he feels he's ready to cede ground.
Really, that would be exaggerating who he is. Charles, you must understand this gentleman is 93.
Yes.
Whatever happened, I think, it's a culmination of ever since he attempted to sack the vice president. Meetings were held, he couldn't do anything. The army took a decision, and the General Chewanga made some pronouncement to the effect that we cannot sack Emerson Mnangagwa. And he couldn't do much until tanks rolled and packed on his gate. He couldn't do anything, and many other things that have happened. If he was the other president, we thought he was powerful and he could reverse things. Probably an attempt to that to reverse things at that time would have been made. But see what happens even yesterday when the whole almost 1 million lari of ZANU-PF supporters came and made a resolution. Today, the SEC, let me call it the SEC,
the equivalent of the SEC,
the equivalent of the SEC, made its resolution, and now the old man is brought by the generals to the studios to make these pronouncements. Even that sentence was missing. I think it is over for General Mugabe, Comrade Mugabe.
Kaira is itching to come in. The gentleman presided over graduation on Friday, a graduation ceremony at Harare University, I think.
Yeah. Charles, I'll go back to my first point, that this is a whole managed process, which is basically public relations. Like Obed has pointed out, and indeed reiterating what I had already stated, that the tone of the language of the statement is speaking to the same thing. Of what happened yesterday, what happened there actually in respect of the power structure, where they say that this resolution, we are reversing this, and we are also removing the president of the party, of the ruling party. Now, the other thing is, me, I'm reading at it from the process, from the fact that this was a culmination of what there has been a power struggle within ZANU-PF since 2008. Since actually for the last 10 years, that power struggle has been there, whether you like it or no. I remember when Joyce Mujuru was sacked as vice president, there were even those statements that Could she respond? Obviously, she couldn't, because the people who had the real power in Zimbabwe were the likes of
that's the image there of the president.
Yes,
yes, with the generals.
Yes, and now that is those are the guys who are in charge of everything.
Yes.
Even the people you saw on the streets, they are not the ordinary Zimbabweans who are calling for regime change, in the sense of regime change. Because if there were those people, they would be making all those statements of saying we are done with ZANU-PF. Don't tell me that an ordinary Zimbabwean is interested in ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF is responsible for the suffering, for whatever is happening in the country. Now, the second thing, trying to contextualize the military there. There is a monograph which the late Dan Abdere, who deserved the titles of comrade as opposed to Mugabe. Mugabe is not a comrade in the real sense of the word. He just uses it to perhaps get
they refer to everybody as comrade.
Well,
anybody who is involved in
comrade,
the
at
struggle.
least I'm talking about the usage of the term. It's in respect of people who believe in the Marxist philosophy of an egalitarian society and what have you. But that military is speaking to a monograph by Dan Abdele called The Emerging Dictators in Uganda. He was trying to give perhaps trying to give the picture of how the situation was in 1980 in Uganda. But if you bring that picture to whatever was happening in the rest of Africa, it's the same thing. Military dictatorship. Until you remove the military from politics, you can't democratize. That argument has been brought to light recently. I've seen it has been coming all of a sudden. General Muntu has talked about it time and again, that the moment you take over power through violence, you use the military to take over, it's extremely hard to democratize. In Zimbabwe, the situation, if it was a democratic country, we would be seeing ordinary civilians commanding the process, trying to tell the man, you go. We would be seeing the Women's League, the Workers' League of ZANU-PF. But what we are seeing is ZDF is in charge. Just like it is the case in Uganda.
Yes.
It has to be the NRM historicals. Even when we are providing an alternative, it has to be General Muntu, it has to be Kanobesije, it has to be General Sejusa. It's speaking to one thing, and you democratize when you have the military at the center.
Wouldn't that become a difficult question to answer, Ivan? Because you say the ideals that pushed Mugabe to work with Chiwenga, to work with Mnangagwa, to work with all these other people, including, I think, Jonathan Moyos and the others, to remove, to fight colonialism. And what drove Yoweri Museveni, Sejusa, Muntu, Kizza Besigye to fight was that aspiration for democracy. The difference here comes in the means that were available to them to create that change.
And the context.
Now, and the context of the time. When it comes to a situation like what you're seeing in Zimbabwe today, many people will be asking, you still have the same gang or the same cabal of people from the 1970s struggle to still at the center of play. The difference would have been a woman like Grace Mugabe and the leader of the youth wing and a few younger people who were not part of that struggle but are trying to take center stage. Joyce Mujuru, both her late husband and herself were part of that struggle that brought Mugabe to power. So do those dynamics in any way make a difference in how they are managing? They are what appears to be a transition from Mugabe, their comrade and founder, to any other person.
I think for me, 2 or 3 things stand out. One is what Mr. Mugabe points out in his eloquently delivered speech about the intergenerational gap and the need to close that in a harmonized and well-managed process. And I think that is true with almost every single revolutionary movement in Africa, whether it's the NRM, which calls itself a revolutionary movement as well, whether it's in Angola or any other African country. You have the carryover of the Bushmen and the the struggle is for independence from especially colonialism. And basically, how do you do that in a continent which has not less than 60% of its population below the age of 40? So you need to have deliberate conversations around closing that intergenerational gap, because with that gap comes a different understanding of the challenges, and more importantly, different understanding of the context and how those challenges should be addressed. So I think that's a very important point that Mr. Mugabe does make. But also,
I'm afraid, gentlemen, we need to take a quick commercial break. We can pick this up after a short break. But the bigger question we'll be asking ourselves is, or we'll be trying to discuss, is could Robert Gabriel Mugabe and the other African leaders that have had to leave, not at their own volition, but to be pushed, could they have avoided this situation? After a short break, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Fourth Estate. My friend Nteja Asima is asking me a question. Who is the president of Zimbabwe now?
Mugabe.
Nteja, I don't know if you watched the president give a speech just a while ago. He laid out plans that his government and the party will be doing in the next coming days. So I don't think he has resigned yet, and the army hasn't announced that it has overthrown him. The party has sacked him as party president, but that process, that still has a process they will have to go through. I'll be checking
Nteje that the people who have been in charge of Zimbabwe for the last 10 years are the ones still in charge. Emerson and group of ZANU-PF.
And I see
group of Emerson.
I see another friend of mine telling me, saying here that as you watch what's happening in Zimbabwe, and Uncle Bob, Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni, is watching closely the events in Cambodia. Better watch out. I don't know what's happening in Cambodia, to be honest. I haven't checked. Do you guys, what's happening in Cambodia? I have no idea what is happening in Cambodia. But a viewer here is alerting us
the situation
to what is going on somewhere in Cambodia. I have no idea what it is. Let's expand this discussion and try to bring it home.
But there is where he had left it.
Yes.
Why he can't see those, that because Mugabe talked about the generational gap. Why you were not seeing the youth? The reality is all these organs were destroyed, and it's just which
is entirely not true.
Most of them.
The G40, the generation 40 of Grace Mugabe is talking to a younger generation. But Grace Mugabe is 52. She'd taken over the leadership of the Women's League. You have I forget the youth leader's name, who came on TV a day after the military, after Wednesday, came on TV the next morning and said what the military had done was wrong, and they were going to roll it back. The people demonstrating on the streets of Harare yesterday were largely younger people, and you have seen them get infused both within the ZANU-PF and the opposition MDC. They are present. The question is, do they appear the same way Kalok, for example, would appear, the NRM group that appeared before the Parliament Committee amending, discussing, does it appear in the same way as the Malema group in South Africa?
Now, Charles,
does it appear? Where is that absence of the young people?
Don't compound the youth. You're seeing as the G40, the likes of Grace Mugabe, and you call them as the youth. Those are just mere social climbers and opportunists. They don't stand for the interests of the youth. They are people whose intention is to benefit and use it as a platform. But
if they fall within a certain generation,
if we had followed that argument, if we had followed that argument, then I would say that Honorable Chibule, Honorable Anite, and others who are youthful in this system represent the interests of the youth. They just
whose interests do they represent?
But those are social claims.
But what right do we have here on the show to classify them? They belong to a certain generation. They hold certain positions. We can debate how or what they represent or what they're aspiring for without taking them out of...
It's just like being black, and we say that you stand
I wanted
for the black
to come in on this one.
Yes.
Anyway, what is happening in Cambodia is that the Supreme Court has ruled disbanding all political parties.
Oh,
anyway,
yes, I said that.
It's as strange as that. But back to what you were saying, the army came in to clear off Mugabe and probably install another historical for business to continue with the what you'd call the dominance and dictatorship of ZANU-PF. But that's not quite true. Primarily the reason why the army came in is because Mugabe was totally obstructing and clearing any other person who would show interest, especially when he looked not to be aspiring to stand again. So he was clearing everybody off to pave way for his wife to probably stand unopposed. And in their wisdom, this is what I'm thinking, the army felt if that is to continue like that, and there is no proper democratic process of ZANU-PF to have candidates and are elected, and on which probably that candidate would compete with others, maybe Emerson Mnangagwa, who had fled to some country, would begin a civil war. So I think in their wisdom, he said, no, come on, dear President, our elder brother, we love you so much, but we cannot plunge our country into civil war because of just wanting to clear and pave way for your wife.
But coming, I would still disagree with
you could just hold on. Let's hear out, because you are going to a certain issue before when we were taking the last break, and you didn't have opportunity to conclude.
There are two things
so if you can pick it up.
That stand out for me in this, especially from reading the reportage on this matter from the international media, the international angle, and where that leaves the democratization project of Africa. 50 years after, on average, African countries gaining independence. If you read reporting from the UK, you'll see an attempt by especially British media to create the impression that China had a very big hand in the coup. Basically, for intents and purposes, it is an overthrow of the president. The reports of Chiwenga, the army commander, the reports of Emerson flying to Beijing and having meetings with the military generals in Beijing, where many of them, in any case, were trained from, and how China had a direct interest in the events going on in Zimbabwe. And of course, Britain and the US co-opted. If you follow, especially reporting by the BBC and British newspapers, there is a certain line of
that is being
a narrative that's being constructed, and that's almost true with almost every unconstitutional change of government in Africa for the last 50, 60 years.
Constitutional changes.
Yes, including Uganda. If you speak to insiders about the overthrow of President Obote when he was in Singapore, and even the NRM, which came
in
preaching, let me just finish. The NRM, which came preaching homegrown solutions and how Mr. Museveni was boasting he didn't get help from anybody. The Monitor recently reported CIA records that were declassified. That connected.
Actually, as you mentioned that, I don't know why that hasn't been long debunked, because President Museveni writes about the support he got from external players extensively in the new edition of
So at the end of the day, and I think that's what my comrade Kakeda has been belaboring to explain. If you have, who actually does this change serve? The change of guards at State House in Harare. In whose interest is it? If you look at China investment in Africa in 2000, it was a paltry about $10 billion. By 2014, that had climbed to at least $220 billion. So China has every single interest in Africa. They have to ensure that their business interests are protected, and if that means regime change, they will do it however subtle they do that. America has interest in the governance of Africa only to the extent that their geopolitical and security interests are taken care of, and business interests are taken care of. So if it means keeping a puppet president in East Africa, as long as it serves their geopolitical interests in the region, they will do that. The Chinese will do that if it serves their interests. So at the end of the day, the question is, what does this leave the African? Where does this leave the Ugandan? Are we part of the conversation on how we govern ourselves?
I said earlier before we took the break that we'll switch to if this could have been avoided. But even before we go there, you raised something interesting that I've been asking myself since the reports of China's involvement started emerging. We do not know yet at this stage the extent to which China has been involved in Zimbabwe. But we know that among the earlier outreaches of China, Zimbabwe has been central. The Southern African countries, this investment you see by the Chinese government in Uganda is significantly smaller compared to what they have invested in Zimbabwe, in Angola,
They inject
in
not less than
Namibia,
$30 million
in
DR
Namibia,
Congo.
in DR
Zimbabwe.
Congo, even in Botswana itself, Southern. They are not so much in Southern Africa, but I mean in South Africa, but those countries in there, they've been heavily involved. And Professor Kasaija, thank you very much. Professor Kasaija has updated us, like you had done. Yes, he says the governing Cambodia People's Party, CPP, of Prime Minister Hun Sen got the Supreme Court of Cambodia to outlaw the main opposition political party. Thank you very much, Professor. And but what does this mean for China, which for many, many years has been seen as a country, as a global player, but playing more soft power, not bothered about your human rights things, not bothered about your internal politics, provided they can get the resources that they need from your country.
In my humble view, it was always going to be.
And especially at a time when the US president has taken an approach of an insular approach of America first. Europe, continental Europe, is in a crisis of its own with tendencies that want to look at the far-right tendencies that wants to look into Europe and forget about the external world. The British have moved out of the European Union. Brexit, they're negotiating quietly. The Germans, you see the processes. The French. What does this mean?
I think in my humble view...
So is China entering the political...
It was always bound to be deceptive because you can't be investing $220 billion, and that's the 2014 figure, in a continent as they're doing in Africa.
And you're not interested
in the politics. But the challenge, of course, for us as Africans and citizens of these countries is how do you create an intersection of those interests and our own interests? Because the Chinese involvement in Zimbabwe, assuming they had that involvement, I was talking to an ambassador of Uganda to one of the countries in the UN Security Council, and was saying he spoke to a few people in China and they're doubting. They think possibly the British and US media is trying to make China look bad. But be that as it may, even if that were not the case, I think China has every reason to be interested in the political structure.
Any other country.
Like any other country is, just like America, just like the UK. But the golden thread that is interwoven in all these countries' involvements in Africa and indeed the third world in general is the interests come first. And at the end of the day, like Professor Dan Nabdere in the University of Dar es Salaam debates used to argue, the ruling class of Africa remains in Washington, in Europe, and now in Beijing.
Let me put a specific question. President Trump derided President Obama for losing American leadership. Because he tweeted attacking President Obama for not taking the lead on the removal of Gaddafi. He lashed out at Obama for not taking the lead in the Arab Spring, guiding the Arab Spring to show American leadership. Now, if China is actually responsible for removing a dictator that was the other day calling him the Golden Goliath at the last United Nations General Assembly, does that force a reset of even President Trump's policies, foreign policy, especially in Africa?
Charles, your question boxes me to a particular frame I will not pursue. It presupposes that now a dictatorship has been removed, so democratic forces have emerged, and which
no. My question is not. I think
the moment you said that,
I think you misunderstand my question.
China,
my question is looking at global power play
yes,
between China and the United States.
The United States.
If the United States finds itself beaten to this change of leadership in a critical African country, does that force a reset, a rethink of the tweets that will be coming out of President Trump's of his phone?
Well, I don't think America has lost anything, and it will lose anything, because just within the same context, it has won a very big regional ally called Sudan. Because right now, Sudan is 24/7 in America's bed. It has succeeded. This very week, when the president of Sudan visited Uganda, in a few days, there was a senior diplomat from America who was also visiting Khartoum. And you have also to know that Sudan is deeply involved in the war in Yemen, and it's fighting on the sidelines of, on the side of the US-led, the Saudi-led coalition, which it happens to be the case that America is supporting that coalition. Then secondly,
they removed sanctions on South Sudan.
They removed sanctions last month.
Yes, on 6th.
They have lifted sanctions. They have also succeeded in making sure that the regime, the Khartoum government, does not continue to be in bed with North Korea and perhaps even China when it comes to the nuclear program. So it makes a score. It can lose Mugabe and still make this score. And actually, if you remember
so maybe China, which is also heavily invested in Sudan, both Sudan and South Sudan, reads that the Americans have regained the upper hand on Sudan. They take revenge in the south of the continent. Maybe.
Actually, what is the strategic interest of America in Zimbabwe? It could be there, but not very important. That if it's U.S. government is not deeply involved in Zimbabwe, that it stands to lose so much.
Okay.
But also, also another thing you have to understand is that, considering given the changes that have happened, the government, which is the leadership which is coming, it will still pursue America's interest.
Okay.
What was happening is that there was just opposition to standing up to the free economy.
Thank you. I need us to end this segment so that we can go back and discuss the implications. Could this have been avoided? Could Mugabe have avoided this? Or not, the international power play?
The international power play, I just wanted to... No, I'm not one person who's quick to jump on the bandwagon that China finally is coming all bare knuckle to involve itself within African politics. The Chinese are very, very cautious. Their primary objective with the relationship with these developing countries, not Africa, are purely economic. Well, they might be interested in the stability of any country where they have invested their billions of shillings. We saw them for the first time sending some peacekeeping force in South Sudan, largely because they felt if that country collapses and goes to the dogs, their billions, especially invested in the oil sector, will be up in the frames. Equally so is Zimbabwe. General Chiwenga flew to Beijing. Probably he went to ask them, please, how do you perceive? Because this is how bad the situation could be. And probably in a soft way, they must be said, for as long as you don't do it violently, for as long as you don't disrupt the general economic order in Zimbabwe, we will support you, though in a certain way. I'm not...
don't downplay the fact.
Isn't that critical? Because every other African gunman, pretender at democracy, if they wanted to make a key decision, they flew to Washington. They flew to London.
But China is the
biggest...
biggest...
Just a moment. The moment they begin taking the flight towards the east, it sends a significant signal, which we can't afford to ignore, to say, okay, maybe China is not, it may not change the dynamics that much.
No, but I mean, you must know, China is the sole trading partner or sole sponsor of the Zimbabwean regime for as long as it has been ailing. So for the general to say, look, let me fly into Beijing and probably try to put my case, is not necessarily to mean that China is finally coming.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we need to take a break. We'll pick that up when we discuss in the last segment, when we discuss could this have been avoided. Let me take a message. Someone says it's quite intriguing in reference to the photo montage of Museveni, Mugabe, portrait hanged in the president's office lounge. Office lounge, parliament office. It is inscribed, the fathers of Africa. It means NRM has been benchmarking ZANU-PF. So let them read line by line. At some point, Uganda will have a different turn. I just wanted to mention that the Chinese currency is one of the official currencies in Zimbabwe, as well as the US dollar. They use those currencies as local currency in Zimbabwe. Andrew Rumba is watching us and says, when Robert Mugabe had just taken power, he was given a nickname Uncle Bob and still stands as one of the world's Pan-Africanists. Emerson Mnangagwa, with whom he has been replaced as party leader and eventually head of state anytime soon, is already nicknamed Crocodile. This is because of what he has been doing as a vice president and a key leader in the party. Now, isn't Zimbabwe jumping from a saucepan into real fire?
Real fire. It's the same.
And
he's still very young.
I'm reluctant to
That's
listen
at the forefront of most of the
to people who are doomsday sayers.
I was listening to the watching CNN a few hours ago before we came here, and you know, they have very nice names. One time, Charles, when you went to Zimbabwe, you wrote an article in the Monitor about how curious we are about the Zimbabwean names. So someone calls himself Love More, and was saying, we just want change. We want to enjoy this moment, regardless of the outcome. Tomorrow will sort itself out. So that's how crazy some of these leaders get.
True, and Kakaire was referring to Zimbabwe as being one of the poorest countries in the world. Actually, lives of ordinary people in Zimbabwe are not significantly different from lives of millions of ordinary Ugandans. Or millions of
Uganda is one of the poorest as well.
Millions. So the situation in Zimbabwe doesn't really.
Even Uganda.
Gentlemen, let's take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll ask the question,
is a poor country.
Could Mugabe have avoided this and other African leaders that have had to go without their will? Could they have avoided this? Welcome back. This last segment of the Fourth Estate, discussing Zimbabwe, the situation there. Before we came on air, you saw President Robert Mugabe give a speech to the nation, an address to the nation, surrounded by military generals. Since Wednesday, the world has been watching developments in Harare when the military decided to move in after giving a warning, decided to move in. We had reports that the president was being held under house arrest, and yesterday we saw demonstrations, massive demonstrations in the center of Harare, of people who came to express their solidarity with the military, the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, and thank them for the action they had taken. In effect, the military has taken over. They have refused to announce that this is a coup because it's not the politically correct language to say coup anywhere today.
In the recent days.
But public relations.
Personally, I feel very impressed by the difference with which these generals handle their colleague, President Robert Mugabe. They have handled him with a lot of dignity, a lot of respect, which is a carryover from their Bush ways.
Reading the Zimbabwean constitution, it's a constitutional dictate that 4 categories of Zimbabweans are treated with decency, respect, and comradeship. 1, those who participated in the liberation struggle. 2, the political prisoners of the liberation struggle. Number 3, those who funded or in any way from whichever part of the world supported the struggle. And therefore, it's ingrained as a value in the society to respect those who made a contribution. And I thought that is really powerful.
And Mugabe is all that.
Yeah. Yes, Mugabe is all that.
It's powerful in what sense. You have to be very clear.
Because I think a society needs to have some of these values.
And one of the things that really got the journalists very angry is Grace Mugabe's
abusive language
of them and abusive language. There's a video that's been making rounds of her questioning who is Mnangagwa, the former vice president, and saying they can deal with it. Gentlemen,
historical.
The critical question for our viewers and for the African continent is looking at the way Mugabe is having to be forced to leave power. Could this have been avoided? And people have made references. The Sunday Monitor today is reporting extensively on African leaders who have had to leave power. Between 2009 and 2017, there are those who were toppled from power, and there are those who have died in power. On the list of those toppled from power, you have people like former Libyan strongman, Muammar Gaddafi. He left after 42 years in a drainage trench. You have Zine Ben Ali of Tunisia, who was just out of power. You have Hosni Mubarak, who was also just out of power. You have the former president of the Gambia, who was pushed out, but after an election. Could Robert Mugabe have avoided this? Yes, you have Alassane Ouattara. No, not Alassane Ouattara. Bagbo, Loro Bagbo.
Bagbo
yes.
of Ivory Coast.
Could this have been avoided?
I think, okay, Obed can go first.
Well, this could have been avoided. One, Robert Mugabe had strong credentials. In a way, he was not these other leaders. He's a person who had led a revolutionary struggle to end the apartheid regime of the British in Zimbabwe. And he had that goodwill of Zimbabweans for all this long time. Even when he was very aging and almost senile, the historicals and the army were so courteous, and they almost wanted him to go on, and probably until he drops dead or when he feels tired, and then he organizes a peaceful democratic handover. But along the way, the attempts to forcefully throw in his young wife to be the next president is what rattled them, and they became violent. You can see even when they have removed him militarily, they're still respectful. They still called him Comrade Gabriel Robert Mugabe. They still called him Commander. So he could have avoided that one, especially, and this what most people are not alluding to. Really, at 93, you totally gone.
But at 93, listening to that speech, he sounds more eloquent.
But
and proficient at language than somebody who is 73 somewhere in East Africa.
Such a kind who was very brilliant anyway. So those flashes of the former Mugabe will always drop, but still, at 93, honestly, he needed to have organized a peaceful, democratic handover of his great party, because I don't think any other person would steer ZANU-PF is still popular.
I'm sure Obed would say the same of Uganda.
No, Obed, by the way, you're having this discussion at a time when we are debating constitution amendment to just create a possibility that exactly what you're talking about can happen in this country. And Zimbabwe held elections in 2013. They are due to hold elections next year. So you cannot say that elections over and on their own are a proper guarantee that you can have change of leadership, especially when you're in control of that election process.
I'm tempted to think that every leader, especially these revolutionary leaders, have their agenda and how they organize the peaceful transitions. We've just had Angola, by the way. Who else?
No, that's a disclaimer.
Who sold? Who sold? No, for sure. It is just recent, Ivan, that Dos Santos shocked the world and told everybody, I'm done. And he hands over to a man who has even sacked his daughter as the head of the petroleum sector. So we saw it with Tanzania's Nyerere and others.
So you as a member of the NRM, what's your game plan?
Not necessarily a member of NRM, but I guess something peaceful and democratic is in pipeline.
It's not there.
There's a significant question there. Yes, Dos Santos has survived it. He's quit. And you can only imagine if he had hung on, what would have happened. Maybe he read the signs and was able to organize that transition.
But he's being applauded for that.
Omar alBashir announced last year that he will be quitting leadership next year, I think. So he's actually doing his final rounds. And there's a possibility that he will see that. But when you have seen what you think is an African strongman, the typical African strongman, they never get to manage how they exit power. Nobody would have imagined it for... The dynamics, the contexts might be different, but could Mugabe have avoided what has happened to him? Could Gaddafi have avoided what happened to him? Could Hosni Mubarak have avoided what happened to him? Could...
I think in my humble view, this really takes us back to what I call the democratization project of Africa. Averagely, African countries have been independent in the sense of attaining self-rule from whichever colonial powers their way for about 55 years. And that's a very short time for you to have built a society that has ethos and institutions that have a sense of purpose as to allow for transition of power in peaceful ways as we see in other parts of the world, which are fairly more developed economically. So I think countries like Uganda, what you're seeing now in Rwanda cropping up, Zimbabwe, Angola, and the rest that have had to have leaders getting out of power in unceremonious ways are essentially those that are still lagging and struggling to have institutions and a culture of peaceful transition of power. And I think it takes a long time. Someone called Professor Handelman did a book entitled The Challenge of Third World Development, and he does a study of about 8 years across the third world. And if you look at the path to democracy and especially transition of power, there is a direct correlation with, for example, the level of development of a country and how much time and effort is put in building institutions that are credible and strong enough to give the guarantees of stability and peaceful change of power. It takes a long time. It's a trial and error. Zimbabwe is why it is possibly. Emerson Mnangagwa might come in, and then you might have another scandal, just as we're seeing with Libya. But I think these are the painful costs of any society to build a path of democracy and governance that works for everyone.
Okay, Samanda Alawi is watching us online, I think from the UK. He says, China, thanks for the show. Thank you, Samanda, for watching and giving us feedback. He says, China, true, has interest in Africa and has invested almost thrice of what the other three traditional Western donors, according to the 2016 Ernst & Young report. Its total FDI to Africa topped the West's with $66.4 billion. And this has created more than 130,000 jobs. Western media reporting are just a blackmail to make China look bad before other African countries who are all in bed with China. With China's well-known policy of non-intervention, China doesn't participate in such, for it would deny her allies who are Asian countries, South America and Asia. African, you wrote, Adrian, I don't know what this means. But he says, China's foreign minister is clear. Africa belongs to the Africans. It is not anyone's cheese.
Country.
Yes, sir.
Now, to contribute to the last question of could we have avoided the situation, and what does
could Mugabe have avoided the situation?
Yeah, I think his thesis, his statement, the last statement, actually, I have to pick it from there. What is the problem for Africa? Basil Davidson, in his book, Nation State, the burden of the black man's burden, nation state, of statehood. Right now, African politics is affected by that, and the whole of the post-colonial state across the world. There is an interesting article I read in the New York Times last year. It's called Fractured Lands. They were looking at the Arab Spring, but then the narrative that comes throughout, it was quite a long piece, like 30,000 words. It's just the statehood. Can you democratize within this artificial state, which is constructed? It's artificial. What you call Uganda, what you call Zimbabwe. And it's what the people in Dar es Salaam were debating 40 years ago, 42 years ago in 1975 and the years below. Before that, and he quoted it well, that, well, this is a project, this thing called Uganda, this thing called Zimbabwe, that when you come as Mugabe, you do whatever it's just like a stage. You play, after that you leave, and others come. Then you weep. The post-colonial state is extremely repressive.
A Senegalese politician, I think, was managed to become president after some time and has since left power, who said leadership is not a matter of perfection, but the desire by each one of us to do our bit for others to continue. Someone is watching us, and Yedidi, I think, he says, African leaders have proved that the only thing man learns from history is that man never learns from history. Just like the Bourbon monarch of France, we have learned nothing and forgotten nothing, and Mugabe is not going alone. There is a possibility of the 2011 Arab Spring-like revolutions in other countries that will be inspired by the events in Zimbabwe. Do you gentlemen, starting with you, Kakede, do you think this is a possibility that you can have a repeat of the Arab Spring happening in the southern part of Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa?
Those are the ones who have not understood the situation in Zimbabwe. I don't. It can happen, but not now. The time is not yet. Until the ordinary people the downtrodden of society, come to that realization, it can happen across the world. Because this project called what all of you are proposing on this forum is that let's have reforms within this institution that has failed. The capitalist state has totally failed.
Okay.
And I predict in the nearest future we can have something like that. But
Okay,
which
I have a message
which
here.
is
I'll not mention
engineered by the ordinary people.
The send of this message, if you want me to
Not the
mention the
military.
name, please send a message and say I'm the one who said it, but I'll read the message. The army seems stuck with the old man. They can't call it an outright coup, but want to give their long-time comrade a good, decent send-off from power. The send of the message hasn't authorized that, hasn't indicated whether they want their name used or not. Let me take a message also from Frederick Musimenta. Frederick Musimenta says, the happenings in Zimbabwe are a tip of the iceberg. The sub-Saharan Africa is having a share of the wide range of succession is inevitable for posterity of a nation. This crop of generals will simply extend Mugabe's deeds and protect their loot. No young people in the picture. Opposition is on the periphery. God bless Africa. Frederick T. Musimenta, founder and chief strategist of Uganda Dialogue Arena in Kampala. Obed wanted to come in.
Yeah, I wanted to disagree a bit with my colleague who says states in Africa are all artificial, no institutions.
The post-colonial state.
The post-colonial states are all artificial. Someone just comes to do his part and then leaves, goes away. There are no institutions. But we're seeing a different situation in Zimbabwe right now. You have, and in my view, a very professional army that has just come in and is not hungry to claim leadership, and probably General Chiwanga becomes the president, suspends the constitution, declares a state of emergency and stuff like that, like it had been immediately after independence. But you see an institution called ZANU People's Defense Forces,
Zimbabwe
Defense Forces, restraining someone they believed was draining them off their democratic path and calling on the people to come and take charge. So in my view, that's a strong institution that has been built over time. We have a party that has, even when the person they thought was a problem to their success and development, are still restrained to probably cause his arrest until they go into the formal processes of disposing him off. In my view, I think those are strong and they are indicative of progress in the
gentlemen, I'm afraid our time
has not been professional at all.
Yes, I'm afraid our time is out.
No. There is something he has stated, that army has been professional. When Zimbabwe was when Robert Mugabe was in charge of that country, that army was used as a tool to consolidate his stay in power. It continues to do the same thing, only that the gentleman now is no longer in charge, and it's Mr. Emerson.
I don't know. I think I have a slightly different view.
Is not professional.
But let's first listen to Ivan.
Very briefly, Charles. One of the things that you said when introducing the show was what lessons, and I think especially in the context of what's happening in Uganda, what's happening in Zimbabwe should be a very important mirror for people like Obed who are workers of the system. Because all the examples you've cited, Charles, whether it's Libya, Tunisia, Uganda, and Zimbabwe, the golden thread interwoven in all those examples is to say no to the question of succession. In other words, to block any debate on succession. And that comes with very tragic consequences. We're only lucky that what's happening in Zimbabwe has not, at least as of the last minute, caused bloodshed. But the country is moving on a very slippery path, essentially because some individuals, out of self-aggrandizement, pursuit of primitive accumulation of wealth, decided the question of succession shall not be discussed. And it's painful to watch in Uganda, adults aware of what's happening in other parts of the continent, going around and doing the kind of things that they're doing for a few a few coins and a few dollars at the expense of having an honest and meaningful conversation on succession. So I think in as much as we can have this conversation in the clouds about international powers and whatnot, it comes and boils down to individuals. For example, the place of Grace Mugabe, if you look at her contribution in blocking the conversation on succession, I've listened to clips where she's saying the president will anoint his successor, even if he's a corpse, we shall present him. And if a few years ago it was criminal for you to even say Mugabe is senile, you'd be arrested under their social media laws. So essentially, because we've constructed barriers for meaningful debate about governance, and I think people like Obed, we talk to you people in NRM, they should be able to read the signs on the wall. Okay,
someone actually helps answer the question we've been battling with. Why President Robert Mugabe didn't make an outright announcement that he was stepping down. And this is from Robert Sempala. He says, Mugabe was not going to resign in a room full of generals, as that would have confirmed that all along this was a coup. He would have resigned under duress. The speech was prepared to exonerate the generals. Next phase, ZANU-PF will stick to its decision made at the Central Committee today and recall him via Parliament. So, now that the generals are in the clear domain, Mugabe will now be let go via a political process and not a coup. Politics is a chess game. Thank you very much, Robert. I think this is a brilliant, a brilliant interpretation of what is going on. Peter Majella is watching us. Says, was wondering if, Peter, we're running out of time, but you could have sent a message on this phone. I would have read it. I think I would have been able to pick it up and read it. I think I partly agree with you, and I'm inclined to think in the same lines as Obed was reading of. Yes, but I think I have issues with
the state.
I think I have issues with your.
But where you don't tell viewers that where, for instance, in Egypt, after the change and all these other regimes where change has happened, you've not seen the real transformation. In countries like Malawi, they have been changing leadership. In Ghana, they have been changing leadership. How come the condition of the people is still the same? That's what we need to discuss as Africa.
When you have entrenchment,
back to 1975.
When you have entrenchment, I've been trying to look through. I've been trying to look through
this project
list
of
current governments that claim
the state
claim they are being in power on revolution. Yeah, they are becoming an endangered species. Oh, yeah. After Mugabe goes on the African continent, it will be difficult to find a regime in power that claims revolutionary credentials.
Just in a few seconds.
Uganda.
I wrote somewhere that the next phase of freedom fighters, the people that shall call African freedom fighters, are those who are going to transform economies, bring Africa on board in respect to the IT revolution, because that is.
Thank you, gentlemen. We need to get out of here. I saw a very interesting picture today of President Uhuru Kenyatta having consultations with former President Daniel Arap Moi, which I think, given the developments in Kenya, is an interesting picture to watch. Wish to congratulate the Forum for Democratic Change. They did a presidential debate earlier today. It was part of the news, and it was partly broadcast live. And maybe finally, before we get out of here, to extend condolences to the family of the late Mzee Kaijabango in Fort Portal, who died and was buried today. He was a minister in Toro Kingdom, I think Minister of State for Security in Toro Kingdom for many years. He passed on this morning. He passed on Friday and was buried today. To you all, gentlemen, thank you very much for making time for the show. Thank you very much to you all, our viewers, for joining us tonight and always. And thank you very much to those of you who sent us feedback. And we were unable to open the phone lines, but you can continue this debate on our social media platforms, both on Twitter, on Facebook, and on WhatsApp. The debate continues. We will be watching what happens, and NTV will bring you updates as and when they happen. The deadline is tomorrow midday to have significant developments. So maybe the announcement will come in due course that everybody has been waiting for. For me, it's a good night, and thank you very much. Of course, I can't forget to say thank you very much to the production crew that stay up late to bring you this show. Have a good night.